Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a real human puzzle, sex.
Mm-hmm.
You've sent over a fascinating reflection that gets right to the heart of why something so fundamental to life can feel so complicated.
It really is complex, isn't it?
Yeah. So our mission is to unpack that complexity for you. We're going to explore why this natural, necessary part of being alive gets tangled up in, everything from our biology to our belief.
From media to relationship.
Exactly. Even pornography, shame, the nature of desire itself. So let's dive in.
It's a powerful starting point that your reflection hits on right away.
Mm-hmm.
This fundamental drive of life wanting to continue.
Right.
And sex, in that context, isn't some scandalous human invention, but really, as your piece articulates, nature's ancient, relentless engine for making that happen.
Yeah, it's just basic biology.
Think about it from the simplest organism swapping genetic material to, the intricate dances of the animal kingdom. It all comes back to reproduction.
Survival is just step one.
As you put it so well, survival is just the first act. Life's real purpose, in a biological sense, is to keep going. It's almost sacred in that way.
Exactly. And it's that foundational point that makes our central question so compelling, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because we humans have clearly built this enormous, often contradictory structure on top of that basic biological drive.
Oh, definitely. We've layered it with romance, with rules of right and wrong, with feelings of embarrassment.
Humor, power dynamics, things we just don't talk about.
Yeah, all of that.
So the core of our deep dive today, directly inspired by your thoughtful piece, is this. Why is something so utterly natural, so essential, also so incredibly complicated for us?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to explore those contradictions, from our biology to our morality, from how sex is shown in the media to our ideas about what relationships should look like.
Right. Trying to understand why we celebrate it in some way.
And yet feel so much shame around it in others.
What's immediately striking in your reflection is this paradox you highlight. Sex is everywhere, and yet somehow elusive.
It really is. It's this constant hum beneath the surface of modern society, isn't it?
Consider advertising. It's used to sell everything from, the most luxurious perfumes to the most mundane household items.
Yeah, it's inescapable there.
It's woven into the fabric of fashion, it pulses through music, and of course it dominates so much of the online world.
Mm-hmm.
As you pointed out, whether it's a lipstick ad or a viral dance trend, sexuality is a language we all kind of instinctively understand.
Right, it's this constant cultural background noise. But then, as you keenly observe, when it comes to having open, honest conversations about sex in our own lives, it suddenly becomes full.
Very difficult, yeah. We're surrounded by sexualized images. We might even be intensely interested in it privately.
Uh-huh.
Yet there's this underlying fear of actually speaking about our own experiences and desires vulnerably.
It's like we exist in this strange middle ground, celebrating a certain kind of abstract sexuality while suppressing our own personal expressions.
Exactly. And a really important point you make is that this isn't just some superficial cultural quirk. It's deeply ingrained in our psychology.
Our discomfort with sex, your reflection suggests, tells us as much about our inner lives as it does about the society we live in.
And that leads us directly to the double standard you dissect so effectively.
Right.
We see this very public celebration of sensuality, but it's often within very specific, carefully curated boundaries.
Like you mentioned, pop stars on stage or those polished presentations on social media.
Think, as you mentioned, of Rihanna's Super Bowl performance or Megan Thee Stallion's music videos, for instance. They're often framed as displays of confidence and even empowerment.
Yes, it's like there's this very narrow lane of sexual expression that's not only acceptable, but even praised.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment that energy shifts, maybe it's a different format, a less polished aesthetic, or simply expressed by someone outside of that celebrity sphere.
It's often immediately labeled as cringe, gross, or even perverted.
You provided some really powerful examples, like the way lingerie is marketed on a billboard versus how it might be perceived on a platform like OnlyFans.
That's a great comparison.
Or the way erotic fan fiction is often dismissed, while a steamy scene in a prestige drama is considered groundbreaking.
It really highlights how we judge sexual expression based on who is doing it and how it's being presented.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's insightful here is your point, that this isn't just about some universal sense of what's appropriate. There's a real cultural hierarchy at play.
Hierarchy. That's key.
Sensuality is often applauded when it aligns with certain ideas of taste and status, when it's seen as something to aspire to.
Right. Polished.
But when it becomes more raw, more vulnerable, or deviates from those mainstream norms, That's when the judgment often kicks in.
And there's that gendered aspect you mentioned, too.
And as you rightly emphasized, there's a significant gendered aspect to this. Women are constantly sexualized in so many ways, yet they can face significant backlash for actually owning or expressing their own sexuality too openly.
While men might get mocked for certain desires.
And men, too, can experience ridicule or shame for their desires, particularly if those desires involve pornography or anything outside of very narrowly defined ideas of masculinity.
And this directly feeds into the idea you explore of media gatekeeping, who gets to tell these stories about sex and whose stories are actually valued.
Yeah, that's crucial.
You drew a really interesting comparison between how explicit content is received in high-end dramas on platforms like HBO or Netflix, where it's often framed as part of serious art, something to be analyzed and discussed even when it pushes boundaries.
Right, art.
But then, as you point out, similar themes or even similar levels of explicitness in other forms of media, think about anime, indie video games, or even the vast world of online fan fiction,
Just get dismissed.
are so often just dismissed, ridiculed, or relegated to this category of niche or adolescent fantasy.
So why the bias? You suggest this bias comes from a few different directions, including a certain cultural snobbery, a Western-centric viewpoint that doesn't always recognize the artistic value in, say, animation dealing with adult themes, and perhaps even a fear of narratives that aren't controlled by those big corporate structures.
Right, because those more independent spaces like fan fiction communities or online kink spaces operate outside of those traditional gatekeepers.
Exactly.
And that lack of control seems to make some people uncomfortable.
And you also highlight how content that explores queer experiences, fetishes, or non-monogamous relationships often faces devaluation, unless it's somehow cleaned up or made more palatable for a mainstream audience.
Yeah, the example you gave about Bridgerton versus a webcomic.
That example you gave about an explicit scene in a show like Bridgerton being seen as steamy, while similar intimacy in a webcomic might be labeled creepy, really makes you think.
It really does, about who gets to define what's acceptable and what's not.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly, your reflection then delves into the evolving landscape of our relationships, particularly focusing on monogamy and the increasing visibility of alternative models. You note that while monogamous marriage has been the assumed norm for so long, deeply embedded in social and religious traditions, that picture is definitely shifting.
Things are changing. Marriage rates are declining in many parts of the world. People are getting married later.
There's certainly a greater openness to divorce or even choosing not to marry at all.
And alongside that, we're seeing this growing awareness and discussion around different ways of structuring relationships.
Right. You mentioned polyamory, with its emphasis on building emotional connections with multiple partners,
Open relationships.
which combine a primary romantic bond with the possibility of sexual connections outside that relationship, and even relationship anarchy,
Which really challenges the rules.
which really challenges any kind of preset rules or hierarchies in how we connect with people.
But despite this growing visibility, you rightly point out that monogamy still holds a very powerful cultural position.
Oh, absolutely. It's reinforced by everything from the romantic comedies we watch to the expectations of our families and even the algorithms of dating apps.
It's still the default, culturally speaking.
What's particularly insightful is your observation about the pressure individuals in non-traditional relationships often face to justify their choices.
Yeah, in a way that people in monogamous relationships just don't encounter.
There's this underlying cultural assumption, isn't there, that non-monogamy is somehow inherently selfish or indicative of a moral failing.
Or commitment issues.
Even within more progressive circles, as you noted, people expressing any kind of monogamy fatigue can be met with skepticism, with questions about commitment issues or fear of intimacy.
But the really crucial point you make is that this isn't necessarily about saying one model is better than another or about replacing monogamy altogether.
No, not at all. It's about recognizing the incredible diversity in how humans experience love, connection, and desire.
Just like with gender and sexuality.
Just as we increasingly acknowledge the spectrum of gender and sexuality, your reflection argues for recognizing that there isn't just one single right way to do relationships.
The one-size-fits-all idea doesn't work.
The real fallacy, as you put it, is the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to something as deeply personal as human connection.
Okay, so pornography. That's another big area your reflection tackles.
Your deep dive then turns to the complexities surrounding pornography, which, as you state, is this incredibly widely consumed yet often intensely private form of media.
Right. It exists in this really strange dual reality, a massive global industry that also operates largely in the shadows of individual experience.
The statistics you cited about Pornhub traffic and overall consumption are quite eye-opening,
They really are.
especially when you consider that those numbers likely underestimate the true extent of its use.
And that really does make you wonder, doesn't it? If it's this pervasive, why does this heavy cloud of shame still hang over it?
Well, you suggest that culturally, we've largely framed pornography as a vice, something people turn to in moments of weakness or isolation.
Yeah, rather than just a normal part of sexuality for some.
But you offer this really important alternative perspective, arguing that for many individuals, particularly those dealing with loneliness, sexual repression, challenges in their relationships, or even past trauma,
For them, it can be different.
porn can actually serve as a kind of emotional release, a private way to explore needs that might not be met elsewhere, maybe even a coping mechanism.
But you don't ignore the downsides.
However, your reflection doesn't shy away from the very real ethical questions that surround pornography. You acknowledge the legitimate concerns about, well, reinforcing unrealistic beauty and performance standards,
And harmful stereotypes.
the possible perpetuation of harmful stereotypes related to race, gender, and consent, and the risk of developing patterns of compulsive use.
So it's really nuanced.
So you really present this nuanced picture. Pornography can be a coping mechanism, a supplement to someone's sex life, a problematic habit when misused, and even, in some instances, a form of, though sometimes awkward, sexual education.
And the key takeaway you emphasize isn't about some kind of moral judgment or striving for purity,
No, not about good or bad in that simple way.
but rather about promoting mindful engagement. You call for creating a space where people can actually discuss their relationship with pornography without feeling instant shame.
To reflect on its role in their own lives, and to make informed choices that align with their own values, rather than just being driven by ingrained guilt.
Which flows right into the impact of shame itself.
This leads into a really critical part of your reflection. The profound impact of sexual shame and our internalized sense of what's right and wrong in this realm.
You point out that for so many individuals, sex isn't just a private matter, it's something they actively keep secret.
Even in close relationships.
Even within close, intimate relationships, the act of expressing sexual preferences or fantasies can trigger a deep-seated fear of being judged, rejected, or labeled in some negative way.
It's that intense vulnerability, isn't it? As you so eloquently put it, our sexual desires expose a really raw, fundamental part of ourselves.
To say, I want this, that's vulnerable.
To admit I want this is to acknowledge a deep longing, a perceived lack, a fundamental human hunger. And instead of learning to be comfortable with those desires,
Society teaches us to hide them.
society often teaches us to suppress them, to hide them, or to sanitize them into something more acceptable.
And where does that shame come from?
You then delved into the origins of this shame, pointing to the influence of religious teachings, family environments where any talk of sex was off limits, and peer cultures that often use sexuality to create social hierarchies and mock curiosity.
And that shame isn't helpful, is it?
Did you make this really powerful statement? Shame doesn't actually transform people into better partners.
Yeah.
It simply makes them more guarded and less communicative.
Mm.
Your reflection argues for reclaiming sexual vulnerability as an essential component of true intimacy,
Being able to just say it.
suggesting that the simple act of being able to say, this excites me, this makes me uncomfortable, or even, I don't really know how to talk about this, but I want to try, is profoundly connecting.
It's about being seen.
It's not just about getting your own needs met, but about allowing yourself to be truly seen and understood by another person.
Which brings us to the ethics of desire and this really personal question of how we navigate our desires when they don't perfectly align with our relationships or our partner's desires at a given moment.
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
You raise this very common scenario. If your partner isn't interested or isn't available, is it okay to turn to things like pornography or masturbation?
You acknowledge that there are different viewpoints on this. Some see it as healthy self-soothing,
While others worry it creates distance.
and others perceiving it as creating emotional distance or being somehow unfaithful.
So what's the ethical approach?
But the crux of the matter, as you astutely observe, isn't just about the act of self-pleasure itself, but about how we approach desire in an ethical way.
Ethical desire. Tell me more.
Ethical desire, according to your reflection, is about acknowledging the reality of our own needs and urges without demanding their immediate satisfaction at the expense of another person's well-being.
So, self-awareness, communication.
It involves self-awareness, open communication with our partners when relevant, and establishing boundaries based on honesty and mutual respect.
It's that focus on the intent behind the action that really resonates. You make it clear that neither denying a desire nor acting on it in private automatically carries a moral weight.
Right. What truly matters is the underlying intention, our level of self-awareness, and our consideration for both ourselves and our partners.
And talking about it helps.
And when we can talk about these desires openly, without fear of judgment or defensiveness, it not only has the potential to improve our sexual lives, but also to deepen trust and create more space for genuine intimacy in our relationships.
Okay. So finally, why is it often just uncomfortable to talk about all this?
Finally, your reflection concludes by exploring why even the act of talking about sex and pornography can be so deeply uncomfortable for so many people.
And it's not just about being prudish.
You emphasize that this discomfort isn't necessarily a sign of being overly conservative or repressed, but often reflects very real, personal, cultural, or psychological sensitivities that deserve to be acknowledged and respected.
Well, what are some of those reasons?
You then outline some of the key reasons behind this discomfort, including the potential for triggering painful memories of personal trauma or abuse,
That makes sense.
the long-lasting effects of cultural and religious teachings that associate sex with guilt or shame,
The social stigma.
the powerful influence of social and gendered stigma that can silence open dialogue, the very real fear of judgment or exposure,
Legal or ethical concerns about media.
legitimate concerns about the legal and ethical boundaries surrounding sexual media, and even simply a lack of practice or safe environments for these kinds of conversations.
Recognizing those sensitivities is key.
Recognizing these sensitivities, your reflection argues, is absolutely essential for fostering more respectful and shame-free dialogue around sex.
Wow. Okay. So summing up this deep dive.
So as we've explored in this deep dive, sex for us humans is undeniably far more than just a simple biological function.
It's so much more. It's deeply interwoven with our identities, our relationships, and the very fabric of our society.
We've seen how cultural norms, media representations, and deeply ingrained moral beliefs create these often complex and contradictory perspectives on something so fundamentally human.
And the piece you shared really shines a light on the powerful and often limiting influence of shame, and the importance of really questioning the boundaries we've built around sex.
Not necessarily to tear them all down, as you wisely point out, but to truly understand where they come from.
And to consider whether they still serve us in a healthy and meaningful way in our lives.
This deep dive really leaves you with a crucial question to consider. Where does your own understanding of sex, pleasure, and desire truly originate?
That's some real food for thought. Are there any inherited beliefs or societal messages that you might find it beneficial to re-examine?
Your reflection suggests that true intimacy really hinges on vulnerability and honest communication about our needs and desires.
Even when it feels a little bit uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Even
Then,
Absolutely. And perhaps this exploration has sparked a desire in you, the listener, to reflect on your own relationship with these topics, or to consider how we can collectively work towards cultivating more compassionate and open conversations about sex in our communities and our relationships.
your reflection ends with this really powerful thought. Talking about sex with honesty isn't about cheapening or degrading it. It's about acknowledging our shared humanity in all its complexity.
And ultimately, this isn't just about the act of sex itself. It's about how we navigate our deepest needs and our most tender selves in the world.